The decade between 1890 and 1900 was a time of tremendous growth and change, not only in Croton, but throughout Westchester. 9 villages were incorporated during the decade, beginning with Pelham Manor and Larchmont in 1891 and ending with Bronxville and Croton in 1898. For Croton, the main impetus was the planned construction of the new Croton Dam. In November 1891, New York City's Aqueduct Commission approved plans and acquired the property for the dam, bringing to an end the process of site selection and planning which had been going on for more than a decade. Leaders in Croton knew this massive project, which lasted 14 years, would be a boon for the village. Hundreds of workers would need to be housed and fed at the construction site and in the village. Machines and building material would arrive by boat to Croton's docks and by rail to the train station. But Croton's existing station was small. Built in 1849, it was located across from the intersection of today's North Riverside Avenue and Grand Street. So on the day after Christmas in December 1890, Harvey P. Farrington signed a contract with the Hudson River Railroad, selling 2 parcels of land along the tracks for the sum of $1, on the condition that the company, quote, erect a station building on or before August 1st, 1892. Farrington was born in 1820. As a young man, he got into the steamboat and barge business and became very wealthy. By the 1880s, he owned most of the land at the north end of the village, about 600 to 700 acres, running all the way up Mount Airy. When Farrington made the deal with the railroad, the local paper wrote, "With a great dam underway and a new station being built in Croton, the town will have a great boom. Let it come. The sooner, the better." Construction ran 6 months late, but by early 1893 the station opened, ready to handle the boom that had already begun. Discussions about incorporating as a village began in Croton as early as 1891. In March of that year, Harvey Farrington went to Washington, D.C. to have the post office name of the village changed from Croton Landing to Croton-on-Hudson. He was successful. The postal name was changed on the 4th of July, 1891. 3 years later, in 1894, efforts were made to formally incorporate. A large meeting was held, but the effort failed. "Incorporation is dead," wrote a local paper. "Many moons will pass before it is resurrected." The proposal was resurrected 3.5 years later, and on February 12, 1898, the village of Croton-on-Hudson was incorporated. The first entry in the village record book concerned the election for village officers, held on March 14, 1898. Most of the entries in the first few years are rather mundane, but one stood out. Dr. Miller, the physician in the village, who also treated workers at the dam, requested permission to create a bike path along the road to the dam, to be used, quote, only in the case he had a call of sickness or accident at the dam. Permission was granted. At the time of incorporation, the village was much smaller than it is today. In the north, the village ended just past the intersection of North Riverside Avenue and Old Post Road North. In the northeast, it ended after the first curve of Mount Airy and the intersection of Harrison and Maple. All the land on the southeastern border that in 1905 became the Harmon development was then owned by members of the Van Cortlandt family, who still lived in the manor house. The house had been expanded and modernized. Much of what you see here was removed after John D. Rockefeller Jr. purchased the property in 1953 and began restoring the manor to the period when Pierre Van Cortlandt lived there. This is what the interior looked like in the early 1900s. The land around the manor house was a farm. There was a barn in the field where people see the blaze today. The photo at the top is looking north across the fields toward the village line. We're standing roughly where Cleveland and Emerson intersect today. If you kept walking along this dirt road in 1898, you would come to the ferry house at Van Cortlandt Manor. This was once part of the Albany Post Road. Today, it's Nordica Drive. The Croton River is down the hill on the left. Out on Croton Point, the Underhill brickyards were still in operation, employing a large force of laborers who lived in boarding houses. This is one of the clay pits, likely the area where the large parking lot is today. The brick ovens and drying sheds were on the north side, where the beach is. There were brickyards on the Croton waterfront as well. This view is looking south at the brickyards, roughly from where the bridge goes across the tracks to Half Moon Bay and the Croton Landing Park today. The land jutting out to the right is Croton Point. This valley was dug through the point in the 1840s, when the Hudson River Railroad was built. All the land in this area has been removed, first to build the Harmon Yards on the right, and for the highway on the left. Here are bricks produced in Croton. Two on the top left were made by the Underhill Brick Company. WAU stands for William A. Underhill. IXL stood for IXL at brickmaking. Next is a Morton brick. The Mortons were a prominent Croton family. To the right, a brick made by the Anchor Brick Company, owned by Schuyler Hamilton, who was a grandson of Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Alexander Hamilton. This photograph, dated February 7, 1896, shows the state of the new Croton Dam site, roughly 3.5 years after construction began. It took that long just to divert the flow of the Croton River, shown in the foreground, and to dig the gigantic hole for the foundation. The first masonry in the foundation wasn't laid until May 1896. The maximum workforce on the project was about 1,500 men. Most of the workers were Italians, and the rest Irish, African Americans, and other nationalities. Some workers moved on to other construction projects after the dam was completed, but many stayed and helped make the village what it is today. Some of the Italians were skilled stonemasons. After the dam was completed, those who settled in Croton quarried local stone and built the stone houses and other local homes. When they worked on the stone houses, Elizabeth Stevenson, one of Harvey Farrington's daughters, would play Italian opera records for the men as they worked. The workers lived in several areas around the dam. Some were housed in barracks below the dam. Some lived in boarding houses in the village and on Mount Airy. Many lived in this temporary community called the Bowery, located along Route 129, heading out of the village toward the dam. In the foreground is the Bowery Bridge, a temporary bridge used to access the main construction site. Here's another view of the Bowery. You can see the dam rising in the distance. One of the many amazing things about the construction of the dam is that with the exception of the stone, most of the material needed was hauled up from the docks and railroad through the village. This included 745,000 barrels of concrete, 125,000 tons of coal, and 500 pieces of heavy machinery, including this train engine, shown here running in reverse, the horses furnishing most of the power. Short sections of track were laid ahead of the engine and were continuously replaced by sections brought up from behind. Let's go back into the village and see what it was like more than a century ago. This is the bridge that once carried Albany Post Road traffic across the mouth of the Croton River. The first bridge was built around 1860. This is what it looked like in the early 1900s. This view is looking north from the Ossining side. The manor house is hidden in the trees. This is looking south, where Brook Street once crossed the railroad tracks, to the docks on the river where the yacht club is today. Grand Street once crossed the tracks as well, to docks where Senasqua Park is located. Both roads and docks existed as far back as the late 1700s. Here we're looking up Brook Street. The buildings in the foreground were destroyed when the highway was built, along with most of Croton's waterfront business district. The building on the right was Peter Fackel's bakery, which he started around 1897. Here's another view of the bakery, with carts waiting outside to be loaded up with fresh baked goods. This unusual building was the Green Hotel. The first floor housed a barber shop and cigar store. This building was gone by 1910. Here's the William J. Morton Jr. Company store, established in 1871. The Mortons were an influential family in Croton for more than a century. They were builders, bankers, brickmakers, merchants, ship owners, and civil servants. The docks owned by the Mortons were at the end of Brook Street, where the horse and carriage are on the left. Nearby was the Union Hotel, known for its rooms with a river view and cool breezes. It was operated by James Degnan, who also served in the offices of the Board of Education and is the treasurer of the fire department. This is the Sherwood Morton home, which is still located at the corner of Riverside and Prospect Place. Sherwood Morton was a master steamboat pilot who, at the age of 21, was running steamboats to and from Croton. A little further up Riverside, where Wolf Road is today, was Harvey Farrington's estate. Unfortunately, his home was torn down, but the gatehouse is still there at the corner of North Riverside and Wolf Road. Going inside into the middle of the village, we're at the intersection of Grand Street and Old Post Road. This is St. Augustine's Church. The land was given by Philip G. Van Wyck and his wife in October 1856. The following July, the cornerstone was set. The vestry minutes resolved, "When we build, we shall build of good, hard, common brick." The bricks came from the brickyard on Croton Point. The bell in the steeple was a gift from the Anglican Church of England. Here we're looking down Grand Street toward the river when it was a dirt road. The block of stone near the curb was used to climb up into a carriage. There are two carriage stones left in Croton. One is next to the driveway of the Acker House, the house on the far left at the end of the street. The other is near the bus stop on Old Post Road, across the street from the high school, at 23 Old Post Road South. This huge building was built around 1866 by Philip G. Van Wyck. It was once located between Grand Street and Van Wyck. Over the years, it was the Willow Tree House, the Kitchewan Hotel, a boarding house, a military academy called the Croton Military Institute, a girls' school, a dance hall. In a way, it's still with us today. In the early 1900s, it was split into three separate buildings and moved. Two sections are now 87 and 89 Grand Street. The third is 22 Van Wyck Street. This is the Old Post Road Inn. In the 17 and 1800s, it was an inn for travelers on the Albany Post Road. It was torn down in the early 1950s. The building on the left is the antique shop in Cornelia Cotton's gallery. This is the second Holy Name of Mary Church. It was built in 1898. The first church was at the end of Church Street. It's now a private home. The church we see today is the third church, built next door to this one in 1929. This building was later torn down. Most of the money used to build the present church came as a bequest from the estate of Bernard F. Coleman, one of the three men who owned the company that built the dam. Here's Asbury Methodist Church, looking toward the intersection with Maple. The church was built in 1881. For a time, the road in front of the church was known as Asbury Avenue. Water accumulated in front of the church in the winter, making an ideal ice skating pond. Now we're back on Grand Street, heading toward the dam. This is the Grand Street School. This was originally a two-room school, built in 1869, expanded in 1890. There were two teachers. One teacher lived down the street. Her name was Carrie E. Tompkins. Today, this building is the Grand Street Firehouse. Here's a class photo taken in front of the school. Next door, Edward White established a general store in the 1880s. A few years later, he started an undertaker business. This is the intersection of Mount Airy and Grand Street, looking back toward the river. The circular object in the street on the right, where the men are standing, was a cistern, collecting water coming down from Mount Airy. There was another cistern at the time, now located below the dummy light. Across the intersection, to the left, was a Quaker meeting house and cemetery, which dated back to 1797. One of the founders was Robert Underhill, who started the vineyard on Croton Point. The land was sold in 1906, and unfortunately the meeting house was torn down. The remains of the individuals buried in the cemetery were moved to other Quaker cemeteries. The local newspaper, the Croton Journal, lamented the loss. For many years, they wrote, the congregation was large and of great influence in the community. This is actually one of two lost cemeteries in Croton. The other was the Van Cortlandt family cemetery, once located in the area of Benedict Boulevard and Wayne Street. The graves were relocated when Clifford Harmon purchased the property. I'll end with this beautiful view from the top of Hessian Hill, looking down on Croton Point, and quote the words from the 1898 Manual of Westchester County, reporting on Croton's incorporation 125 years ago. They made an observation about Croton, which is still true today. The village is attractive as a residence locality, and its citizens are progressive.